tomorrow we have two talks. The seminar room hosts a talk by Desai Surendran, who is a doctoral student at Harvard University, speaking on the importance of being modern, discussions on Buddhism and modernity in India, 1920 to 1950. At the same time, that is 3 p.m., 21st February, just in case you don't end up in the wrong room at the right time, Dr. Christina Thome of the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, who is speaking on Australian responses to the Indian famine of 1876-78, Empire, Sympathy and Ferocity. This will be held in the Annex building in the Federal Commons. On the 22nd of February, which is Friday, for some reason it's Thursday in my list, but it's Friday, we have a public lecture in the same series as today on India and the wider world. A very distinguished speaker, leading Latin Americanist, Professor Varun Sani from Jawaharlal Nehru University, problematizing the BRICS, Southern Hemisphere grandeza, Northern Hemisphere geopolitics. On Monday, we have a very distinguished visiting scholar, Dr. Ashok from Stockholm University. He's also at the Institute of South Asian Studies, the National University of Singapore, speaking on partition violence in Punjab in 1947. And Tuesday's regular Tuesday seminar is Dr. Kamal Nayan Chowdhury, Junior Fellow of NMML, speaking on the subject he's researched at quite some depth, the law as a site of contestation between state and the margin, the Forest Rights Act, and the politics of marginal society. There are a couple of other events next week. Forgive me, I'll just quickly run through them. Professor Brij Sankha, speaking again in the India and the World series on India and Japan, varieties of Asian regionalism, and Dr. Ranjini Mazumdar on Thursday from JNU on the retro turn in Bombay cinema. This particular public lecture series on India and the wider world is of particular interest because it tries to bring together perspective on how the world is evolving and changing today, with a sense of how we came to be where we are, a sense of future as it unfolds, and a sense of the past as it had unfolded. We are very privileged today to have Professor Ashok Desai with us. He has for quite some time been consultant editor of the Telegraph. His columns in Business World are widely known. He has had not only a distinguished, but if I may say so, extremely diverse career. He has been chief consultant in the Ministry of Finance between 1991 and 93 at a very critical juncture in the making of economic policy. He was involved very intimately in designing the early economic reform. Every time we have a conversation, I am reminded that I ought to pigeonhole him, which I will now do publicly with all of you as witness, that he should be interviewed as part of our oral history project, because he also has a prodigious memory for matters of extremely significant detail, which illustrates how policy is often made or unmade. In the 1980s, Professor Desai coordinated a very significant survey of energy for the International Development Research Center, Ottawa. He has also in the past taught as well as conducted research at the University of South Pacific in Fiji and the University of Sussex in England. He is the author of several books. Even a short, very quick list would include India's Telecom Industry, History, Analysis, Diagnosis in 2006, India, Strategy for Further Reforms in 2000, The Price of Onions 2009, he was chairman of the report on the Task Force on Capital Markets, and his other works include 15-volume series of a book which was in 15 volumes called the Energy Review series, published between 1986 and 88. A view to the South, India and the Indian Ocean, Professor Ashok Desai. Without further ado, because I do think that he has a very fascinating set of insights to share with us, I'll hand over.
Thank you, Professor Rangaraj. I might just add that The Price of Onions is my favorite book. I greatly enjoyed writing it. It happened that when BJP was in power in 1997-98, onion prices rose tenfold within 3 months. And the Punjabis were extremely upset because onions disappeared from their meals, and the BJP government, Vajpayee, sent a plane to Iraq together with the joint secretary to get iron. And that was the beginning of the book. It was published in 1998 and it went into 2 editions. And I now find that there is more demand for it. So I'm going to bring out a very cheap edition within the next 3 months, which will be slightly longer and updated, but after that advertisement, letting it down to the subject. As you know, political parties are defined by their ideologies, and when they get into power, they try to take their nations into their own ideological direction. And as you are aware, that the original ideology of the Congress was that the British had in the regime, in the reign of 150 years, deindustrialized India, and it had been left behind, and that independent India had to accelerate industrialization and catch up with industrial countries. Now, this was quite an understandable ideology in that era, because clearly the rise of Britain and the rise of the Western world in general was related to its industrialization. And so it was understandable that the first government of independent India had to also face industrialization. And this was, I would say, my ideology as well when I was a young man. But then I started doing research on the Indian economy. And I started having second thoughts about it. I started my career in the 1960s, and one of my first research projects in the 1960s was on technological capability and technological impulse. And at that time, the reigning ideology was that technology was necessary for industrialization, that India was too dependent on foreign technology for its industry, and it had to generate its own technology with research and development. And the way to do it was by restricting imports of technology. This is the same kind of thinking as was being applied to foreign trade. At that time, the ideology was that India had to industrialize, and to industrialize it had to create its own industries, it had to protect them, so it had to restrict imports. And the same idea was being applied to technology as well. And one of my first research projects was on technology imports. And I went around Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, interviewing various industrial firms, and I found, surprisingly, that the firms which were the biggest importers of technology were also spending the most on R&D. And this made me think, now what is happening? These people, most of them were government firms, and government firms had easier access to technology. They all had their offices in Delhi, they were all subsidiaries of ministries, so they could get permission to import technology much more easily. But still, the firms like, let's say, Indian Electricals and so on, had extremely heavy R&D budgets. And then I realized, I talked to the people in R&D, and they said, I asked them, what do you do your R&D on? They said, whatever we can't get from abroad, that's what we do R&D on. In other words, they were doing import substitution in technology as well. So I then asked them, why do you import technology? So they said, that way we can get into production much faster. And it's very often much cheaper to import technology than to make up our own, which was perfectly true. In other words, they were making a perfectly rational choice between technology imports and R&D. And this is what led me to the idea that it was really not necessary to have any policy on technology imports. The firms should be allowed to decide. Now that was in the 1960s. And after that, the Indian economy got into trouble and into serious balance of payments problems, especially after the oil crisis of 1973. And so this is my idea that you should let people import things freely. It was not a very popular idea. And other ideas of mine also were not popular. So I went and worked abroad. In the 1970s, I went and taught in Fiji. In the 1980s, I went and did work on energy in Canada. What happened was that when in the 1970s I couldn't work in India, that was the time of the energy crisis. So I worked on energy and wrote a few papers. And then I forgot about it. I came back to India. India became as free as ever. In the 1980s, I came and started working here on technology. And then people realized abroad that I was one of the pioneers in energy research. So I got this job in Canada to organize a very big project on energy. So I went off to Canada and I came back in 1986. And then I was looking for work and I walked into the room of a friend in the planning commission. And he said, why don't you do a study for us on trade policy? So I said, never. You won't like my views and you won't pay me. So he said, no, that can't happen while I'm sitting here. So I took on this study and I found that the government at that time was issuing 1 million import licenses a year with all the attendant corruption and red tape. And because of all this red tape, the costs had risen. Import restrictions had raised costs and slowed down Indian firms' reaction, with the result that India's exports were uncompetitive. And so the government was giving 6,000 crores in export subsidies, with little effect. Exports were not going up. So I suggested that the government should issue import licenses which were not commodity specific. There should be just licenses to import anything and give them to exporters in proportion to their exports and let them sell them in the market. And then the exporters would make a profit on import licenses and the government would stop giving the subsidy. It just happened that there was a general election in 1991 and Dambaram became Commerce Minister and he did precisely this. He called his import licenses exim scripts. He gave them to exporters in proportion to their exports and let them sell them. And it was very successful. It was too successful. Within 3 months, people started forging import licenses. Would you please all switch off your cell phone, including you? So people started forging import licenses, but the Commerce Minister by that time had the self-confidence to abolish import licensing altogether on capital goods and industrial inputs. That was the beginning of liberalization. So after that experience, Dr. Manmohan Singh took me to the finance ministry to help design the reforms. And we brought down import duties, corporate tax rates, income tax rates. We introduced competition in telecommunications. But soon I had trouble with Dr. Manmohan Singh's favorite advisor, and I was soon deprived of executive functions. And at that time I thought about it. I thought, well, if I hang on, maybe my luck will change. Then I decided that the way to change policy was not to join the government. In the government, people were always looking behind them, wondering what was going to be the impact of any policy. People were always cautious. It was very difficult to make anyone do anything in the government. The way to change policy was to create public opinion for it. And that is what I have been doing now for 20 years by writing in the press. So in these 20 years after 1993, GDP per head has gone up 2.7 times. GDP has gone up 3.8 times. And India has become the 5th largest economy after EU, ES, China, and Japan. It will soon become the 4th largest. It will this year just get ahead of Japan. And it is because of this rise in the eyes of the world, it has become a member of BRIC, and it has become a member of the Group of 20. And we have to ask ourselves, what comes next? What can we do next? And there are some people who dream of India catching up with China. This, I think, is unrealistic. The Chinese economy is today more than twice as large as India's, and till now it has been growing faster. India can also not catch up with EU or US. They are much richer. And the impact of the liberalization of the 1990s has petered out. The growth rate is falling. It has fallen to 5%, and I'm sure it will fall further to 4%, perhaps 3%, perhaps even 2%. And so we need to think anew. We need new policies to stimulate the economy. And here we have to start with the present situation, the present facts, which are that India has proved itself competitive in education and health because of low wage costs. And this advantage can be used internationally, but for that India needs to raise the standards of its education and healthcare. And the quickest way, if you look back at the history of trade controls and technology controls, you must realize that the way to raise standards is to import standards. You must import, you must allow foreign universities and teaching hospitals to operate freely in this country, to set up branches here. You should allow students freely into India, and you must let them work in India if the government allow Indians to work in their country. This part must be reciprocal. If other countries let us work in their country, let our people work in their countries, then we should also allow their nationals to work in our country. Next, today, African countries' GDP is 1/3 of India's GDP. And the number of university students in Africa is also roughly 1/3. So they are really, the whole of Africa, if you take the whole of Africa, in economic terms, it's a very small entity compared to India, and we can afford to let African students come any numbers here without any impact. And we can let them work in India after graduation. It will increase the supply of graduates in India, and even more important, it will increase the supply of educated friends of India in Africa. And this is why I propose two things. First of all, unilateral free entry for Africans and in general for developing country people. Unilateral free entry meaning that we should remove our visa restrictions irrespective of what they do, because it can't make much difference. And this should apply also to the smaller Asian countries. Similarly, East African countries' exports are 1/10 of India. And this also argues for unilateral free entry for African goods. Again, it would have very little impact on India, but would bring those countries much closer to India. Let me now come to the next point, which is that there are three kinds of transport: land transport, water transport, and air transport. Of these, water transport is the cheapest. It's even cheaper than land transport. Ports are quite easy to construct. Port construction was, shall I say, industrialized in the late 19th century. The last big port that was built, the big artificial port, was Madras. Madras was built partly in the 1870s and partly just before the First World War. You may perhaps not realize, but Madras, the coast in Madras, is absolutely straight. There is no indentation there. There is no way, there was no place for ships to stop there. And what the British did was that they built a sort of cabin there. They built along the coast, they built one wall this way, one wall this way, one wall this way, with an entrance at the north. And that is the Madras Harbour. It was built just before the First World War, and it is a completely artificial harbour, and a very good harbour. It is India's second biggest port today. That was the last big port to be built in this part of the world. But the technology for building ports has existed right from that time. But governments don't like to build ports. They like to expand existing ports, because what matters is not just the port, but the infrastructure which connects the ports with the land. The railway infrastructure, the roads, electricity, and so on. So there are enormous economies of scale in port building, and all the traffic gets concentrated in a small number of ports. Now India has a coastline of 7,500 kilometers, but proportionally it has very few ports. Just consider the United Kingdom has 389 ports. France has 159, Germany has 98, Italy has 311, Spain has 105, Greece has 103, the US has 531, and little Japan has 292. Even China has 172, Indonesia has 54, Brazil has 81, and India has 72. Now, if we are to expand the number of ports in India, we have to realize that India cannot have big ports because of its coast. Big ports require big indentations, big and deep indentations into the coast, and we just don't have any more. So one big indentation we do have is Bombay, and that is our biggest port. Otherwise, we have been having to make do with smaller ports. 3 major ports are being developed. One is Gangavaram near Vizag. It has a draft of 21 meters. This is what matters. The ships, the size of the ships a port can take depends on the depth in the port. And this is called the draft. And the draft of Gangavaram near Vizag has 21 meters. Mundra is 18 meters. And Dhamra, which is being built in Orissa by L&T and Tata Steel, is going to have 17.5 meters. But most of our ports have draft of 12 to 15 meters. Can I have this first? The next one. Right. So just look at this. You have here, for some of our ports, the minimum depth, minimum width, and distance from the sea. Number of berths. Now you can see that, let's say Vadinar, which is going to be in Gujarat, will have a minimum depth of 23.5 meters. This is the deepest, this will be the deepest port in India. In Madras, the outer harbour has a depth of 19.2 meters, inner harbour has 18.6. Vizag has outer harbour 17.5, but these are our deepest ports. As you can see, the rest of all the ports are between 10 and 15 meters. And our coastline is such that we cannot really build any more deep water ports. So what we can do and we should do is that we should build many new ports of 12 to 15 meter depth. We could create maybe a couple of dozen ports of this depth along the peninsular coastline and connect them to the existing roads and railways. The roads and railways are already there. There is a West Coast Railway, but there are railways running all the way from Kutch to Trivandrum to Kerala, and the railway line along the east coast is a bit further inland, but there is equally a railway line along the eastern coastline. So we can use these, if we build these ports and connect them up with the existing roadways, then we can use traffic, sea traffic, marine traffic between the ports to reduce the load on the roads and railways, to decongest the roads and to create new traffic flows. And if we do this, if we construct a dozen or 2 dozen ports, we learn how to sort of industrially manufacture ports, and we'll make them much cheaper, and then we can apply this technology all over the world, especially in Africa, which has very few small ports, and we could create a lot more ports in East Africa. Now, this shows the largest ships in the world. These are cargo ships. Cargo ships they are given names, they are classified. And the smallest ship is called a feeder. Its draft is usually around 6.5 meters. its length is usually 100 meters, and its beam, its width, is about 18 meters. And it carries roughly 6,000 dead weight tons. The next one is feeder max. It has a draft of 7.5 meters and so on. So you can see that the larger the cargo ship, the greater the draft it requires. If you have a ship of, let's say, 5 to 10,000 tons, the draft it requires is roughly 7 to 8 meters. If you have a ship of 100,000 tons, it requires a draft of maybe 14 or 15 meters. So the bigger the ship, cargo ship, the deeper the draft required by it. And so if we build ports with a draft of about 12 to 15 meters, then these ports will accommodate all cargo ships except the post-Panamax, except the largest one. Up to 60,000 tons, they will accommodate the ships comfortably. Can I have the just right? We see the reports. So these are the largest ships in the world. You have tankers. Tankers carry oil. The largest tanker is 234,000 tons. Its length is 380 meters. Its beam is 68 meters. And its draft is 24.5 meters. It goes at the average speed of 16.5 meters. Speed doesn't matter because ships usually travel at a much lower speed than they are capable of. Because the higher the speed, the greater the fuel consumption, and nowadays because oil is so expensive, ships travel very slowly. However fast they can go, they actually travel at only about 12 to 15 kilometers an hour. So speed doesn't matter. But as you can see, a tanker, the largest tank is 234,000 tons, which is the largest ship you have today. The largest container ship is 175. Bulk carrier is 199. Cruiser is 225. Gas LNG carrier is 162. A liner is a passenger ship. The largest passenger ship is Queen Mary II, 148,000 tons. What the largest warship is American Enterprise, 95,000 tons. Warships are usually smaller because they have to go faster. Speed is what matters in a war, and so warships are usually smaller and thinner and sort of leaner. As you can see, its beam is only 40 meters. And for comparison, you have two stage ships at the bottom. The last one is the largest sail ship built before the coming of the steamers. It was built in 1858 and its tonnage was 18,900 tons. Its length was 211 meters and its beam was 25 meters. We don't know its draft, but we today have a sailboat which is very comparable to it, which is a cruise boat. I mean, it is for just having fun in the Mediterranean. It has an engine, but it also has sails, and it is called Club Med 2. And Club Med 2 has a tonnage of 15,000 tons, which is very similar. Length 194, being 20 and its draft is 5 meters. In other words, it is very likely that sail ships before the coming of the steam age had drafts of roughly 5 to 6 meters, no more. And that's why sail ships sailed everywhere. They anchored in many more ports. And as ships have grown, they have required greater and greater drafts, and so the number of ports they can use has declined. So what I'm suggesting is that we should create a large number of quite shallow ports of 12 to 15 meters draft, which would of course be able to accommodate only ships of draft up to 15 meters. In other words, Panamax and sub-Panamax ships, 60,000 tons or less, carrying 3,000 TEUs. TEU means 20-foot equivalent. This is a definition of a standard, what are they called? These boxes which go into. That's right. So they can carry 3,000 TEUs or less. And we should build ports for ships of this sort. Build ports in India and build ports in Africa. And we should standardize the sizes at 60,000 tons and less, and use them for both cargo services and liner services, both along the Indian coastline and in the Indian Ocean, across the sea to the African countries and to Indonesia. So this is basically my proposal for the next stage, namely that India should make coordinated investments in, first of all, minor ports, secondly, the logistics with the hinterland, thirdly, in small ships suitable for movement in the Indian Ocean, and fourthly, a navy with a large number of smaller boats capable of protecting a much larger number of small ships. Just now, the way we have built our navy is that we want bigger and bigger ships, big destroyers, and aircraft carriers, and so on, because our entire attention is on the Suez and that area, and on the protection of big ships. So we have a very small number of very large ships in the navy. If we follow the strategy which I'm suggesting, we'll have a very much larger merchant navy and will require many more ships in the navy, but they would have to be much smaller and faster. If we follow this strategy, then it would have the effect of, first of all, a low-cost development of our coastal regions. Secondly, stimulus to the development of the Indian Ocean countries. Thirdly, greater interdependence between these nations and us. And finally, greater influence of India in a region where it is less likely to face competition. In other words, what I'm saying is that it is unrealistic of us to think of becoming a great superpower in the next 20 or 30 years, but it's perfectly realistic for us to think of becoming a regional superpower. Thank you.